The first thing people noticed about Michael was not his wealth. It was his kindness. Long before he owned delivery vans or employed drivers, Michael had been the young man everyone trusted. If he promised to deliver something, it arrived on time. If he borrowed money, he paid it back exactly when he said he would. If someone needed help moving goods across town, Michael was always willing to lend a hand, even before he had a business of his own. That reputation became the foundation of his dream. Starting with one battered second-hand pickup truck that he bought through years of savings and a small cooperative loan, Michael launched a tiny transport business in Lagos. He named it Reliable Route Logistics because he believed reliability mattered more than flashy advertisements. The beginning was difficult. There were mornings when he woke before 4 o'clock to inspect his truck, load goods, and personally drive hundreds of kilometers before returning home late at night. He handled everything himself: finding customers, collecting payments, repairing broken tires, negotiating with suppliers, and balancing the company's books. Many nights he slept in the truck because driving home would cost more fuel than he could afford. But he never complained. Every successful delivery brought another recommendation. One customer became 3. 3 became 10. Within 5 years, Michael had expanded from one old pickup truck to 3 delivery vans and a small office tucked inside a busy commercial district. It wasn't a huge company. It wasn't famous. But it was honest. And Michael was proud of every single step that had brought him there. His greatest supporter during those years was his wife, Sandra. They had met long before success entered either of their lives. Sandra had worked as a cashier in a neighborhood supermarket while Michael struggled to build his business. They often joked that between the two of them, they barely earned enough to afford dinner. Yet somehow they laughed through those difficult days. When Michael proposed, he couldn't afford an expensive diamond ring. Instead, he bought a modest gold band and nervously asked her to marry him while they shared roasted corn by the roadside after work. Sandra had cried happy tears before saying yes. Back then, she often told her friends something that made Michael smile every time he heard it. "I didn't marry Michael because he's rich," she would say proudly. "I married him because he's the hardest working man I've ever met." Michael believed those words with all his heart. Their wedding had been simple: plastic chairs, a rented community hall, friends from church, family members, no celebrities, no luxury decorations. But the room overflowed with genuine happiness. When they moved into their first apartment, a tiny one-bedroom flat with cracked walls and unreliable electricity, they celebrated as though they had purchased a mansion. Sandra decorated the sitting room with inexpensive curtains she had sewn herself. Michael built a wooden bookshelf because they couldn't afford to buy one. Every evening they ate together, sharing stories about their day. Sometimes the lights went out in the middle of dinner. Instead of complaining, they lit candles and continued talking while laughing at their own situation. Those memories became Michael's greatest treasures. As the business grew, life became more comfortable. They upgraded to a larger apartment. Michael hired drivers. Sandra no longer needed to work at the supermarket. She helped with bookkeeping and customer calls from the office. For a while, everything seemed perfect. People admired their marriage. Friends often described them as inseparable. Whenever someone complimented Michael's business success, he always smiled and replied, "None of this would have happened without my wife." Sandra would blush every time. Neither of them imagined how quickly life could change. It began with something no one expected. Fuel prices increased sharply. Almost overnight, transportation costs doubled. Many of Michael's long-term clients demanded lower delivery rates because they were struggling too. Michael faced an impossible choice: charge more and lose customers, or charge less and lose money. He chose the second option, hoping the crisis would pass quickly. Instead, it became worse. His monthly profits disappeared. Soon he wasn't making money anymore. He was simply trying to survive. Then came the first major disaster. One of his delivery vans broke down while transporting goods to another state. The engine was beyond repair. Replacing it would cost nearly as much as buying another used vehicle. Michael emptied his emergency savings to fix it. Before he could recover financially, another blow landed. The second van was involved in a highway accident. Thankfully, no one died, but the repairs consumed almost everything Michael had left. He refused to panic. "Businesses have difficult seasons," he told Sandra one evening while studying financial records spread across the dining table. "We'll recover." Sandra forced a smile. "I know," but there was uncertainty in her eyes that Michael had never seen before. Weeks became months. Bills piled higher. Customers delayed payments. Suppliers demanded immediate settlement. Every morning Michael woke with another financial problem waiting for him. Still, he continued fighting. He met clients personally, negotiated payment plans, worked longer hours than ever before. Even after dismissing several employees to reduce expenses, he continued paying severance packages because he couldn't bear sending families home with nothing. One afternoon, his office manager rushed into his office looking terrified. "Sir, what happened?" "The driver handling today's electronics shipment isn't answering his phone." Michael frowned. "He probably entered an area with poor network." "I thought so too." "So?" "The truck's tracking device has been disabled." Michael's heart skipped. Within minutes he was calling every emergency contact connected to the driver. Nothing. Hours passed. Still nothing. By evening, reality became impossible to ignore. The driver had disappeared, along with goods worth millions of naira. The customers demanded compensation immediately. Insurance refused to cover the loss because certain documentation had not been completed before the shipment left the warehouse. Michael felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. That night he barely slept. Sandra found him sitting alone in darkness. "You should come to bed." "I can't." She sat beside him. "We'll survive this." Michael nodded weakly. "I hope so." But deep inside, hope was becoming increasingly difficult. Over the following weeks, creditors began calling almost every hour. Some remained polite. Others threatened legal action. Banks demanded overdue loan repayments. Suppliers refused further business. Every ringtone on Michael's phone became another source of anxiety. He stopped answering unfamiliar numbers. One morning he arrived at the office to find a legal notice pasted across the entrance. The landlord wanted months of unpaid rent. Employees watched silently as Michael removed the paper. Nobody spoke. Everyone already knew the company was dying. Despite everything, Michael continued showing up every day. He refused to abandon his responsibilities. Even after selling personal belongings to pay staff salaries, he insisted on giving every remaining employee their wages before paying himself. One older driver approached him before leaving the office. "Boss." Michael looked up. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I can't continue working without salary." Michael forced a smile. "I understand." The driver hesitated. "You gave me work when nobody else would." Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take care of your family." The man walked away, wiping tears from his eyes. Michael remained standing in the empty warehouse long after everyone had gone home. Rows of unused shelves surrounded him. Silence echoed through the building that had once buzzed with activity. He remembered the excitement of signing his first major contract there. He remembered celebrating company anniversaries with cake and soft drinks. Now, only emptiness remained. The final blow came from the bank. Unable to keep up with repayments, Michael watched helplessly as officials repossessed his last remaining delivery van. He stood on the roadside while the tow truck drove away. That van represented years of sacrifice, years of dreams, years of hope, gone within minutes. By the end of the week, Reliable Route Logistics officially ceased operations. 10 years of relentless effort had ended in complete failure. Michael packed the few belongings left in his office into 2 cardboard boxes. A framed photograph from his wedding, a calculator, several notebooks filled with business ideas, a coffee mug Sandra had once given him with the words "World's Best Husband" printed on it. He stared at the mug for a long moment before carefully placing it into the box. As he locked the office door for the last time, he whispered softly, "Thank you." Felt like saying goodbye to a close friend. The journey home was unusually quiet. Traffic crawled through the streets while Michael replayed every decision he had ever made. Could he have borrowed less? Expanded slower? Hired different people? Trusted fewer employees? Questions filled his mind. Answers never came. When he finally reached home, he noticed something strange. The front door was already open. Several suitcases stood near the entrance. Sandra was folding clothes into one of them. Michael stopped. His tired face slowly filled with confusion. Sandra. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she zipped another suitcase before looking directly at him. Her expression was cold. Unfamiliar. What are you doing? She took a deep breath. I'm leaving. The words hit harder than any financial loss. Michael laughed nervously. Leaving? I can't do this anymore. He stared at her, convinced he had misunderstood. What do you mean? I'm tired, Michael. Tired of what? She looked around the apartment. The debt, the stress, the constant fear. He walked toward her. We'll recover. No. We always find a way. She shook her head. There isn't a way this time. Michael reached for her hands. She pulled them away. Please. Listen to me. I've already listened for months. I just need more time. She looked into his eyes. You've had enough time. Silence settled between them. Michael could hear only the ticking clock on the wall. I love you, he whispered. Sandra closed her eyes briefly. Then she said the words that would haunt him for years. Love doesn't pay bills, Michael. He felt something inside him break. This isn't you. It is. We made vows. I know. For better or worse. I know. So why are you leaving now? Tears gathered in Sandra's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Because I refuse to spend the rest of my life waiting for miracles. Michael stood motionless. I believed we were partners. We were. What changed? You lost everything. The sentence landed like a hammer. Outside, thunder rolled across the evening sky. Rain began falling against the windows. Sandra picked up her suitcase. At the doorway she paused. For a brief moment, Michael hoped she might change her mind. Instead, she quietly said, I hope one day you understand. Then she walked out. The apartment door closed behind her. Michael remained exactly where he was. He didn't chase her. He couldn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than the debts, the failed business, or the empty bank account. For the first time in his life, Michael was completely alone. He slowly sank onto the worn-out sofa, staring at the closed door through tear-filled eyes. In a single year, he had lost his company, his employees, his dreams, and now, the woman he believed would stand beside him forever. As rain continued pouring outside, Michael whispered into the empty room, I'll find a way. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But somewhere beneath the crushing weight of heartbreak and failure, a tiny spark of determination still refused to die. That tiny spark would one day grow into something the world had never imagined. The morning after Sandra left, Michael woke to a silence that felt almost unreal. For years, his mornings had begun with the sound of another person moving around the apartment. Sometimes Sandra hummed while making tea. Other mornings she complained about the traffic she could already hear outside. Even the smallest sounds had made the apartment feel alive. Now there was nothing. No footsteps. No conversation. No laughter. Only the slow ticking of the wall clock and the distant noise of cars passing outside. Michael lay on the sofa where he had fallen asleep the previous night. His neck ached, and his eyes were swollen from crying. But the emotional pain inside him hurt far more than the physical discomfort. He looked toward the bedroom. Sandra's side of the wardrobe stood empty. The dressing table where she kept her perfumes had only dusty outlines where the bottles had once been. Even the framed wedding photograph was gone. She hadn't just left him. She had erased herself from their home. Michael sat quietly for several minutes before taking a deep breath. What now? He whispered to himself. There was no answer. Only reality. The business was gone. The money was gone. His marriage was over. Yet the landlord would still expect rent. The electricity company would still demand payment. Life had not stopped simply because his world had collapsed. He forced himself to stand. The apartment looked smaller than ever. Bills covered the dining table. Letters from banks lay unopened on the floor. His phone vibrated again. Another unknown number. He already knew who it was. Creditor. He switched the phone off. For just 1 hour, he wanted silence. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael sold almost everything he owned. The television went first. Then the refrigerator. The dining table. The microwave. The washing machine. His laptop. Even the comfortable sofa that he had bought after signing his biggest transport contract. Every item carried memories. Every sale felt like saying goodbye to another chapter of his life. One afternoon, an elderly man arrived to buy the wooden bookshelf Michael had built with his own hands shortly after marrying Sandra. The old man admired the craftsmanship. "You made this yourself?" Michael nodded. "Yes. You must be good with your hands." Michael smiled faintly. "I used to think so." The man noticed the sadness in his voice but didn't ask questions. After paying, he carefully carried the shelf outside. Michael watched from the doorway until the truck disappeared around the corner. The apartment looked emptier than ever. Within another week, he could no longer afford the rent. The landlord wasn't cruel. He had known Michael for years and understood what had happened. Still, business was business. "I'm sorry," the landlord said gently. "I've already given you extra time." Michael nodded. "I understand. You've always been a good tenant. I'll leave by tomorrow." The landlord placed a hand on his shoulder. "I truly hope things get better for you." "So do I." The following afternoon, Michael packed everything he still owned into 2 old travel bags. His clothes, a few books, the notebooks filled with business ideas, his late father's wristwatch, and one small photograph from his wedding that Sandra had forgotten to take. He stared at the picture for a long moment. 2 young people smiling with complete confidence in the future. Felt like looking at strangers. Without another word, he slipped the photograph into one of his notebooks. He wasn't ready to throw it away. Finding another apartment proved impossible. Most landlords demanded several months' rent in advance. Michael didn't even have enough money for 1 month. Eventually, he found a tiny single room at the edge of a crowded neighborhood. The roof leaked. The window barely closed. The bathroom was shared with 6 other tenants. The room was so small that once he placed a mattress on the floor, there was barely enough space to walk. Still, it was shelter. That first night, rain leaked through the roof onto one corner of the room. Michael moved his mattress several times before finding a dry spot. Lying awake in darkness, he stared at the ceiling. Just months earlier, he had managed employees, negotiated contracts worth millions, and planned company expansion. Now he was worrying about rain dripping into his room. Life had changed with astonishing speed. Yet something inside him refused to surrender. The next challenge was finding work. Michael updated his resume and applied to transport companies throughout Lagos. He believed his 10 years of experience would surely impress employers. He was wrong. Some companies never replied. Others rejected him after seeing that he had previously owned his own business. One interviewer smiled politely. "We're looking for someone who can follow instructions." Michael frowned. "I can." The interviewer shook his head. "People who've been bosses usually struggle taking orders." Another company offered him a salary so low it wouldn't even cover his monthly food expenses. Still, Michael almost accepted. But the position required relocating to another city immediately without accommodation. He simply couldn't manage it. Weeks passed. His savings disappeared. One morning, he counted the money remaining in his wallet. It wasn't enough for another week. For the first time in many years, fear settled deep inside his chest. Not fear of failure, fear of hunger. One afternoon, while walking through a busy market, Michael noticed several traders arguing with a delivery rider. "You promised these goods yesterday. The customer canceled because you came late. This is the 3rd time." The rider apologized repeatedly. Watching the argument, something caught Michael's attention. Every trader had the same complaint. Late deliveries, lost packages, poor communication. He quietly stood nearby, listening. An elderly woman selling vegetables sighed loudly. If only there was someone reliable. Those words stayed with Michael long after he left the market. Reliable. That single word reminded him why customers had once trusted his own company. Not because he was the biggest, because he kept his promises. That evening, an idea began forming. He couldn't afford trucks. He couldn't rent warehouses. But maybe, just maybe, he could start delivering packages himself. The next morning, Michael visited several second-hand bicycle shops. Most bicycles were too expensive. Finally, he found one parked behind a repair workshop. Rust covered the frame. The paint had almost completely faded. One handlebar grip was missing. The seat had been stitched together several times. The owner noticed Michael examining it. "You want to buy? How much?" The mechanic named a price. Michael counted the money in his pocket. It was almost everything he had left. He hesitated. The mechanic studied his face. "You really need it?" Michael nodded. The older man smiled. "I'll reduce the price." Michael looked surprised. "Why?" "You remind me of myself 20 years ago." After paying, Michael wheeled the bicycle outside. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't modern. But it moved. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. His new business began with handwritten flyers. Fast and reliable local delivery. He photocopied dozens of copies and spent 2 days distributing them around markets, pharmacies, small shops, and restaurants. Most people barely looked at them. Some politely accepted them before throwing them away. Others laughed. "Can a bicycle compete with motorcycles?" Michael simply smiled. "I'm offering reliability." Few believed him. His first customer came 3 days later. A tailor needed urgent fabric delivered across town. Michael completed the delivery ahead of schedule. The customer paid him immediately. Before leaving, she said something unexpected. "I'll recommend you." The following week, she did exactly that. One customer became 3. 3 became 7. Soon Michael spent every day cycling across the city carrying parcels, documents, groceries, medicines, and clothing. He left home before sunrise, returned after sunset. Every evening his legs ached. His hands developed blisters from gripping the handlebars. His shoulders burned from carrying heavy loads. Still, he refused to complain. One afternoon, while making a delivery near his former office, Michael slowed down. The building looked different. A new company occupied the space. Fresh paint covered the walls. The old sign bearing the name Reliable Route Logistics had disappeared completely. For several seconds, Michael simply stood there. Memories flooded back. Signing contracts, celebrating birthdays with employees, sharing jokes during lunch breaks, dreaming about expansion. All gone. A young security guard approached him. "Can I help you?" Michael smiled softly. "No, I was just remembering." The guard looked confused, but Michael climbed back onto his bicycle and continued riding. He refused to let the past stop him. His greatest lesson came not from success, but from observing failure. Every delivery introduced him to different businesses. He noticed warehouses where workers wasted hours searching for products. Factories where trucks waited endlessly because paperwork wasn't ready. Retail stores that lost customers because deliveries arrived late. Companies spending millions while operating inefficiently. Instead of criticizing, Michael carried a small notebook. Whenever he noticed a problem, he wrote it down. Route planning, inventory management, driver accountability, customer communication, digital tracking, fuel efficiency, warehouse organization. His notebook filled rapidly. At night, after eating simple meals of rice or noodles, he visited a public library that offered free internet access. There he spent hours studying. He watched lectures about supply chain management, read books written by global logistics experts, researched successful transport companies in Europe, Asia, and America. Sometimes the librarians had to remind him they were closing. "You'll sleep here one day," one elderly librarian joked. Michael laughed. "Not if I can help it." He borrowed every logistics book available. When he finished those, he moved on to business strategy, technology, finance, and international trade. His education had restarted. Only this time, failure was his teacher. Months turned into a year. Michael became well known among market traders. Not because he was rich, because he never disappointed customers. If he promised 10 o'clock, he arrived before 10. If heavy rain delayed him, he called ahead. If a package was fragile, he protected it carefully. People began asking specifically for the bicycle delivery man. The nickname made him smile. One afternoon, two young men watched him loading several parcels onto his bicycle. One laughed. "Look at this man. He's working so hard just to survive." The other shook his head. "I'd rather beg than do this." Michael heard every word. He didn't react. Instead, he tightened the ropes securing the packages and continued working. An elderly woman nearby called after him. "My son." Michael stopped. "Yes, Mama?" She handed him a bottle of cold water. "I've been watching you for months." He accepted it gratefully. "You never complain." She smiled warmly. "People laughed today. They won't laugh forever." Michael thanked her before riding away. Her words stayed with him all day. One evening, after another exhausting day of deliveries, Michael sat alone in his small room studying maps spread across the floor. He began connecting ideas from his notebook. What if deliveries could be tracked digitally? What if trucks followed optimized routes instead of random ones? What if warehouses across different countries communicated in real time? What if logistics companies focused on efficiency instead of size? The possibilities excited him. For the first time since losing everything, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about the future. He looked at the old bicycle leaning against the wall. His paint was chipped. His chain squeaked. His tires were worn. To everyone else, it represented poverty. To Michael, it represented something completely different. A second chance. He smiled to himself. "They think I'm starting over," he whispered. "No, I'm starting better." Outside, the city continued its endless noise. Inside the tiny room, surrounded by notebooks and impossible dreams, a new vision was quietly taking shape. Michael had lost his business. He had lost his marriage. He had lost his wealth. But he had gained something far more valuable: perspective. And although the world saw only a poor man riding an old bicycle through crowded streets, the foundation of a future global empire was already being built. One delivery, one lesson, and one determined pedal stroke at a time. The rainy season arrived with relentless determination. Every morning, dark clouds gathered over Lagos before the sun had fully risen. Streets flooded within minutes of heavy rain. Traffic stretched for kilometers, and frustrated commuters searched for shelter under shop awnings and bus stops. For most delivery riders, the weather was a disaster. For Michael, it was another problem to solve. He wrapped every package in thick waterproof plastic before leaving his room each morning. He carried extra ropes, spare bicycle tubes, and a small repair kit in an old backpack. Even when rain soaked his clothes, the goods he delivered always arrived clean and dry. His customers noticed. One morning, Mrs. Adeola, the tailor who had become one of his earliest clients, welcomed him with a surprised smile. "I honestly thought you wouldn't come today." Michael carefully handed her parcel across the counter. "I said I would deliver it by 9. She checked her watch. It was 8:53. She laughed. "You've never been late." "I try not to be." Mrs. Adeola shook her head. "You're different." Michael smiled politely. "No, I just keep my promises." She looked at him thoughtfully before saying something that would change everything. "I have someone you should meet." The following afternoon, Mrs. Adeola introduced Michael to her younger brother, Tund. Unlike his sister, Tund worked for a medium-sized manufacturing company that produced household cleaning products. His job involved coordinating deliveries to wholesalers across Lagos and neighboring states. The company was struggling. Orders arrived late. Drivers frequently disappeared for hours without explanation. Customers constantly complained about damaged goods. The warehouse manager blamed the drivers. The drivers blamed traffic. Management blamed everyone. After listening quietly, Michael asked a simple question. May I see your delivery schedule? Tund looked surprised. You understand logistics? Michael smiled faintly. I used to own a transport company. Tund handed him several documents. Michael studied them for nearly 20 minutes without speaking. Then he reached for a blank sheet of paper. You have 12 delivery vehicles. Yes. Why are 8 of them driving through the same route every Monday? Tund frowned. That's how we've always done it. Michael nodded. And on Wednesdays, 2 trucks leave half empty, while another is overloaded. Tund blinked. I never noticed. Michael continued. Your warehouse shelves are arranged alphabetically instead of by delivery frequency. So, your workers spend too much time searching. Tund stared at him. Within 30 minutes, Michael had identified over 20 costly mistakes. None required expensive technology. None required hiring more employees. They simply required better planning. Tund leaned back in amazement. Where did you learn all this? Michael looked down at the papers. Mostly from failing. A week later, Tund called unexpectedly. Our managing director wants to meet you. Michael hesitated. I'm just a delivery cyclist. Not after what you showed me. The meeting took place inside a modest office building. Michael arrived wearing his cleanest shirt, though the collar had begun to fade from years of use. Several executives looked at him skeptically. One of them whispered loud enough for others to hear. Is this the consultant? Another smirked. He came on a bicycle. Michael pretended not to hear. The managing director, Mr. Hassan, welcomed him warmly. Tund speaks highly of you. Michael nodded respectfully. I appreciate the opportunity. Mr. Hassan slid several reports across the table. If you believe you can improve our logistics, show us. For nearly 2 hours, Michael analyzed every document. He drew route maps, suggested warehouse changes, recommended delivery schedules based on fuel efficiency instead of tradition. He even proposed simple communication systems between drivers and warehouse staff. When he finished, the room fell silent. One executive finally spoke. These ideas could reduce our transportation costs by almost 30%. Another added quietly, and delivery times by nearly half. Mr. Hassan smiled. When can you start? Michael blinked. You mean? I mean we're hiring you. Michael's new role wasn't glamorous. He wasn't given a luxurious office. He didn't receive a company car. Instead, he spent most days inside warehouses wearing reflective safety vests and steel-toe boots, talking directly with drivers, loaders, mechanics, and dispatch workers. Some employees resisted him immediately. One senior supervisor crossed his arms during their first meeting. So this bicycle man is here to teach us our jobs? Michael remained calm. No, I'm here to help us all work better. The supervisor scoffed. We've done this for 15 years. Michael smiled. Then you probably know the problems better than anyone. The unexpected answer caught the man off guard. Instead of arguing, Michael asked questions. What slowed them down? What frustrated them? Which processes wasted the most time? Within days, workers who had initially disliked him began offering suggestions willingly. Michael listened carefully to everyone. He believed good ideas could come from any level of a company. 3 months later, the results were impossible to ignore. Fuel expenses dropped dramatically. Customer complaints decreased. Delivery accuracy reached record levels. Warehouse productivity increased. The company saved millions of naira. Mr. Hassan called an emergency board meeting. At the end of the presentation, every graph pointed upward. The finance director smiled broadly. I've never seen improvements this fast. Another executive asked, what software did we buy? Mr. Hassan smiled. We didn't buy software. What then? We hired Michael. News spread quietly through business circles. Not newspaper headlines. Not television interviews. Just conversations between business owners. There's a logistics consultant solving impossible problems. Who? A former transport operator. What's his company called? He doesn't have one. Soon another manufacturer hired Michael, then a pharmaceutical distributor, then a food processing company. Michael continued cycling to every meeting. Some executives laughed when they saw his bicycle parked outside expensive office buildings. They stopped laughing after seeing the results. Despite earning better money, Michael refused to change his lifestyle. His room remained the same. His bicycle remained the same. His meals remained simple. Every extra naira went into savings. Friends who occasionally met him questioned his choices. "You've started making good money again." Michael nodded. "So why are you still living like this?" He smiled. "Because I remember what losing everything feels like." Every evening after work, Michael continued studying. His tiny room became filled with notebooks. Maps covered the walls. Charts lay scattered across the floor. He researched international shipping, port operations, artificial intelligence, fleet management, supply chain automation. He discovered that many African logistics companies still relied on outdated systems while global competitors embraced technology. An idea slowly formed. Africa didn't simply need more transport companies. It needed smarter logistics. The dream refused to leave him. One Saturday afternoon, while reading inside the public library, Michael noticed an announcement on a business website. A large European manufacturing company planned to expand distribution across West Africa. They needed a logistics partner. Several multinational corporations had already submitted proposals. Michael laughed softly. "What chance do I have?" Yet something inside him refused to let the opportunity go. He downloaded every document. For the next 3 weeks, he barely slept. He studied road networks across multiple countries, border regulations, port capacities, rail connections, customs procedures, fuel costs, weather patterns, political risks. By the end of the month, he had written a proposal unlike anything the company had received. Instead of simply offering transportation, he redesigned their entire supply chain. A month passed. No reply. Then another. Michael assumed they had chosen someone else. Life continued. One Tuesday afternoon, while delivering medical supplies, his phone rang. An unfamiliar international number appeared. He almost ignored it. Instead, he answered. "Hello." A woman spoke with a European accent. "Am I speaking with Mr. Michael Adeyemi?" "Yes. My name is Claire. I'm calling from Global Industrial Manufacturing." Michael stopped walking. His heart began racing. "We've reviewed your proposal." "Yes. Our executive committee would like to meet you." Michael looked around in disbelief. "When?" "Next week." The meeting took place through a video conference inside a rented office because Michael's room had no stable internet connection. 6 executives appeared on the screen. Each represented a different country. They questioned him for nearly 4 hours. Why should they trust someone without a large company? How would he handle international operations? Where would he find equipment? How could he compete against multinational logistics firms? Michael answered honestly. He admitted what he didn't have, then explained what he did. "I don't own hundreds of trucks, but I understand how to make every truck work efficiently. I don't own warehouses across Africa, but I know where they should be. I don't have thousands of employees, but I know how to build the systems they'll eventually use." The executives listened carefully. Near the end, one elderly board member leaned forward. "Mr. Adeyemi." "Yes. You've spoken very little about making money." Michael smiled. "Because if I solve your problems properly, you'll make money. And if you make money, we'll both succeed." The old man smiled. "Interesting." 2 weeks later, another email arrived. Michael opened it inside the public library. His hands trembled as he read. "Congratulations. Global Industrial Manufacturing has selected your proposal as the winning bid." He read the sentence 5 times. Then again. The contract wasn't enormous by international standards. But for Michael, it represented everything. A second beginning. The contract required him to establish an actual logistics company. Not next year. Immediately. Michael spent the following weeks completing registration documents, renting a tiny office with only 2 desks, and hiring his first employees. The first person he employed was a young woman named Esther, whose previous employer had closed unexpectedly. During the interview, she apologized. "I don't have much experience." Michael smiled. "Can you learn?" "Very quickly." "Can I trust you?" She answered without hesitation. "Yes. You're hired." His second employee was David, a former warehouse supervisor who had once lost his job after exposing theft inside another company. Many businesses considered David troublesome. Michael considered him honest. He hired him immediately. The company needed a name. Michael thought carefully. His old business had been called Reliable Route Logistics. This time he wanted something bigger, something that reflected his vision. After hours of thinking, he finally wrote 2 words across a notebook. Horizon Global. A horizon represented possibilities beyond what people could currently see. Global represented the future he intended to build. Thus, Horizon Global Logistics was born. It began inside a modest office with peeling paint, second-hand furniture, unreliable electricity, and only 3 employees. Visitors often looked disappointed when they arrived. "This is the company?" Michael smiled every time. For now, winning the first contract became the beginning of something extraordinary. Global Industrial Manufacturing praised Horizon's performance. Orders arrived ahead of schedule. Costs remained lower than expected. Communication exceeded every previous provider. At the end of the first year, the client renewed the contract, then doubled its size. Other international companies took notice. One recommendation became another, then another. Michael reinvested every kobo. Instead of buying luxury cars, he leased trucks. Instead of moving into a mansion, he upgraded warehouse technology. Instead of spending profits, he built systems. His accountants occasionally questioned him. "Sir, you can finally reward yourself." Michael smiled. "I am." "How?" "By making sure this company survives without depending on luck." Outside, the world still saw only a quiet businessman who occasionally arrived at meetings on an old bicycle. No newspapers celebrated him. No television stations interviewed him. No one recognized the significance of the small company steadily growing in the background. But beneath the surface, something remarkable was happening. While others chased attention, Michael was building infrastructure. While competitors spent fortunes on appearances, he invested in efficiency. While wealthy businessmen measured success by luxury watches and expensive cars, Michael measured success by deliveries that arrived exactly when promised. The world had forgotten the man whose transport business had collapsed. No one realized that from the ashes of that failure, a far greater empire had begun to rise. And before long, Horizon Global Logistics would become a name recognized across continents, while its humble founder remained almost completely unknown. 5 years had passed since Sandra walked out of the apartment carrying 2 suitcases and leaving Michael with the words that had nearly destroyed him. In those 5 years, life had taken both of them in very different directions. Sandra had reinvented herself. Michael had rebuilt himself. Sandra's world revolved around appearances. Michael's revolved around purpose. Neither of them knew just how close fate was to bringing them together again. Sandra adjusted her sunglasses as she stepped out of a white luxury SUV in front of an upscale shopping mall in Victoria Island. The driver hurried to open the door before she even reached for the handle. "Good afternoon, ma'am." She barely acknowledged him. "Wait here. I'll be about an hour." "Yes, ma'am." Sandra walked into the mall with confident strides, her designer handbag hanging elegantly from her shoulder. Her expensive heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, drawing curious glances from shoppers. She had changed. The young supermarket cashier who once stitched curtains by hand had disappeared years ago. Now her wardrobe consisted of imported designer dresses. Her wrist sparkled with diamond bracelets. Luxury perfumes followed her wherever she went. People who met her today would never imagine she had once counted coins just to buy groceries. Her life had transformed after meeting Richard Benson. Richard was exactly the type of man magazines loved to feature. At 38, he owned several luxury hotels, a chain of exclusive nightclubs, real estate developments, and investments in entertainment companies. Newspapers regularly described him as one of the country's most eligible millionaires. He enjoyed attention. More importantly, he expected it. His social media accounts showcased private jets, yacht parties, luxury vacations, and expensive watches worth more than the average person's annual salary. Every achievement became an opportunity for photographs. Every dinner became a publicity event. Every gift became a headline. Sandra had been fascinated from the beginning. Dating Richard felt like entering a completely different world. They dined at restaurants where one meal cost more than her former monthly salary. They flew first class to Dubai, Paris, London, and Cape Town. She attended exclusive charity galas wearing gowns custom-made by famous designers. For the first time in her life, strangers recognized her in public. Not because she had accomplished anything remarkable, but because she was Richard Benson's girlfriend. She loved the attention. She loved the admiration. Most of all, she loved never having to worry about money again. That afternoon, Sandra entered an exclusive bridal boutique where several assistants immediately greeted her. "Welcome back, Miss Sandra. The wedding gown is ready for fitting." One consultant carefully led her toward a private room. Inside, the dress stood on a mannequin beneath soft lighting. Sandra gasped. Layers of imported lace shimmered delicately. Thousands of hand-sewn crystals reflected the light like tiny stars. The long train stretched across nearly half the room. "It is beautiful," Sandra whispered. The consultant smiled proudly. "It arrived from Italy yesterday." Another assistant carefully helped Sandra into the gown. When she finally turned toward the full-length mirror, she barely recognized herself. For several seconds, she simply stared. "This?" Her voice trembled slightly. "This is perfect." The consultants exchanged satisfied smiles. One of them asked, "Have you finalized the guest list?" Sandra nodded. "Almost." She picked up her phone and opened the latest version. Nearly 600 names. Politicians, actors, musicians, business executives, influencers, television personalities. Everyone who mattered. As she scrolled through the names, her fingers suddenly stopped. Michael. She stared at his name for a long moment. One consultant noticed. "Family?" Sandra hesitated. "My ex-husband." "Oh." The consultant awkwardly looked away. "You're inviting him?" Sandra slowly smiled. "Yes." Later that evening, Sandra met her closest friends for dinner at an expensive rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room while soft jazz music played in the background. Her friends eagerly discussed wedding decorations, celebrity guests, and honeymoon destinations. One finally asked, "So, are you really inviting Michael?" Sandra took a sip of sparkling water before answering. "Yes." Another friend laughed. "Why?" Sandra leaned back comfortably. "I want him to see what he lost." One woman frowned slightly. "Isn't that a little harsh?" Sandra shrugged. "He spent years promising me a better future." She looked around the luxurious restaurant. "Richard actually gave me one." Her friend Chioma smiled mischievously. "Imagine his face when he sees Richard's Convoy." Everyone laughed. Another added, "He'll probably come wearing those old clothes." Sandra smiled. "I doubt he even owns a suit anymore." The table erupted with laughter again. One friend raised her glass. "To moving on." Everyone toasted. Yet despite joining the laughter, a tiny voice inside Sandra asked an uncomfortable question. Why did she still care what Michael thought? She quickly pushed the thought away. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, Michael sat inside Horizon Global Logistics International headquarters reviewing quarterly reports with his executive board. The contrast between both worlds couldn't have been greater. His office occupied the top floor of a modern glass building overlooking the city. Yet, unlike most billionaire offices, it contained surprisingly little luxury. Simple wooden furniture, large digital logistics maps, shelves filled with books, No golden decorations. No expensive artwork. No unnecessary extravagance. The board meeting had already lasted 3 hours. Executives from Europe, Asia, and North America joined through video conference. Regional directors discussed expansion into South America. Financial officers reviewed investment opportunities. Technology teams demonstrated new artificial intelligence systems for route optimization. After listening quietly, Michael finally spoke. "Our growth is excellent." Several executives smiled. But they knew whenever Michael used that word, another challenge followed. "But customer satisfaction has dropped by 2% in East Africa." One regional director immediately nodded. "We noticed." "What caused it?" "Border delays." Michael looked toward another executive. "Solutions." Within seconds the room transformed into an intense strategy discussion. No one interrupted. No one tried to impress him. Michael preferred ideas over titles. The newest employee could challenge a senior executive if their argument made sense. That culture had become one of Horizon's greatest strengths. Near the end of the meeting, Michael stood. "Excellent work." The executives relaxed. "We'll continue tomorrow." As everyone gathered their documents, his personal assistant entered carrying a stack of envelopes. "These arrived today." Michael thanked her before returning to his desk. Most envelopes contained partnership requests, charity invitations, conference invitations, award ceremonies. He declined almost all of them. Then one elegant cream-colored envelope caught his attention. No company logo, no business branding, simply his name written neatly across the front. Michael opened it. Inside lay a beautifully designed wedding invitation. He immediately recognized the names: Richard Benson and Sandra Okafor. For several seconds he simply stared. The room suddenly felt strangely quiet. His assistant noticed the unusual expression. "Everything all right, sir?" Michael nodded slowly. "Yes." "Important invitation?" He smiled faintly. "Something from the past." After she left, he unfolded the small handwritten note tucked inside. "Come and witness the life you could never give me." He read the sentence twice, then a third time. Surprisingly, he didn't feel angry. He didn't feel jealous. He didn't even feel sadness. Instead, he felt something unexpected. Gratitude. If Sandra had stayed with him, would he have become the man he was today? He honestly didn't know. Closing his eyes briefly, he remembered the rainy evening she had walked away carrying her suitcases. Back then, the pain had seemed unbearable. Today, it simply felt like another chapter of life. He folded the note carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. That evening, Michael visited the modest neighborhood where he had once lived after losing everything. He did this every few months. Not because he missed being poor, because he never wanted to forget. He parked several streets away and walked alone. Children played football with a homemade ball. Street vendors sold roasted corn. Motorcycle mechanics repaired engines beneath old trees. An elderly woman selling fruit recognized him immediately. "My bicycle customer." Michael laughed warmly. "It's been a while." She hugged him. "I heard you're doing well." "I'm trying." She shook her finger playfully. "No, you're doing very well." Michael bought fruit from her despite her attempts to refuse payment. Nearby, another familiar face approached. It was the elderly mechanic who had sold him the rusty bicycle years earlier. "You still have it?" the old man asked with a grin. Michael smiled. "Every single day." The mechanic laughed loudly. "You became rich and still ride that old thing?" "It reminds me who I am." The old man's eyes softened with pride. "I always knew you'd go far." Michael smiled politely. "No, you simply encouraged me when I needed it most." The old mechanic waved dismissively. "I only reduced the price. You gave me hope." The mechanic became quiet. Some gifts could never be measured by money. Later that night, Michael returned home. Unlike many billionaires, he didn't live inside an enormous palace. His home was elegant but comfortable, private, peaceful. His favorite room wasn't the luxurious living area. It was his study. There, Surrounded by books and maps, he often reflected before making important decisions. He placed Sandra's invitation on the desk. Should he go? There seemed little reason. The past belonged in the past. Yet another thought lingered. She had invited him, not because she wanted reconciliation, because she wanted him to witness her happiness. Perhaps attending would finally close a chapter that had remained unfinished for years. His phone rang. It was Daniel, Horizon's vice chairman. "Good evening, Chairman." "Good evening. We've confirmed Sunday's investor meeting." Michael looked at the wedding invitation again. "What time?" 1 o'clock. He smiled. "Excellent." The wedding ceremony began that same afternoon. Interesting coincidence. "Chairman?" Daniel asked. "Yes. Our convoy will collect you from home as usual." Michael thought quietly, then answered, "No." A brief silence followed. "No, I'll meet everyone there." Daniel sounded confused. "Are you sure?" "Completely." "Should we send security?" Michael smiled. "I'll be fine." After ending the call, he looked once more at the invitation. A slow smile appeared. He already knew exactly how he would arrive. Across the city, Sandra admired herself once more in the bridal gown during the final fitting. Everything was ready. The decorations, the flowers, the celebrities, the media coverage, the luxury cars, the millionaire groom, and her special guest. She imagined Michael walking into the venue wearing old clothes, embarrassed by the overwhelming display of wealth surrounding him. She imagined the pity in people's eyes. She imagined finally proving that leaving him had been the right decision. She smiled with satisfaction. "This wedding," she whispered softly, "will be unforgettable." She was absolutely right. It would become unforgettable. Just not for the reason she imagined. Because while Sandra believed she had invited her struggling ex-husband to witness her greatest triumph, she had unknowingly invited the richest man in the entire ceremony. And before the day ended, every guest would discover that the quiet man they laughed at was the billionaire whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across the world. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. After several days of heavy rain, the skies above Lagos were a brilliant shade of blue. Warm sunlight reflected off the glass buildings, and a cool breeze drifted through the city as though nature itself had decided to celebrate. Inside one of the city's most luxurious event centers, workers hurried from one corner to another making final preparations. Florists carefully arranged thousands of fresh white roses imported from Europe. Event decorators adjusted golden chandeliers suspended from the high ceiling. Musicians rehearsed softly near the stage while photographers tested their cameras. Outside, security guards checked invitation cards as luxury vehicles rolled through the gates one after another. Mercedes-Benz, Range Rovers, Bentleys, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, several Rolls-Royces. Every arrival attracted attention. Guests stepped out dressed in custom-made suits, elegant gowns, expensive jewelry, and designer shoes. Conversations filled the air. "This wedding must have cost hundreds of millions. I heard celebrities are coming. They say Richard invited foreign investors too. The food alone is probably worth a fortune." Everyone expected a spectacular event. No one expected the man who would become the center of attention. Across the city, Michael stood quietly inside his bedroom. His home was spacious, elegant, and tastefully designed, but there was nothing flashy about it. He disliked unnecessary extravagance. On his neatly made bed lay two options. One was a perfectly tailored navy blue Italian suit that one of his assistants had prepared for the investor meeting later that afternoon. Beside it rested a neatly folded pair of faded jeans, a clean white shirt, and an old brown jacket he had owned for years. Michael looked at both outfits for several moments. Then he smiled. Without hesitation, he reached for the simpler clothes. After dressing, he walked into the garage. Luxury vehicles lined the polished floor. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, a Bentley Flying Spur, a Mercedes Maybach, a customized Range Rover. Several armored SUVs reserved for executive travel. His head of security, Musa, approached him immediately. "Good morning, sir." Morning, Musa. The convoy is ready whenever you are. Michael smiled. It won't be necessary. Musa looked confused. Sir, I'll be riding today. Musa already knew what that meant. The bicycle? Michael nodded. The bicycle. The security chief hesitated. Sir, today's investor meeting involves international board members. I know. And you'll be arriving on the bicycle. Musa laughed softly. In 20 years of security work, I've never met anyone like you. Michael picked up an old bicycle helmet hanging near the wall. I'll take that as a compliment. Near the back of the garage stood the bicycle. Its faded blue paint had chipped away in several places. The seat had been repaired more than once. The handlebars showed signs of years of use. Anyone seeing it would assume it belonged to an ordinary delivery rider. Michael gently wiped a little dust from the frame. He remembered buying it from the elderly mechanic after selling nearly everything he owned. He remembered his first delivery, his first customer, the countless rainy days it had carried him across Lagos. Many people had advised him to throw it away years ago. Instead, he had paid professionals to restore its mechanical condition while deliberately keeping its old appearance unchanged. It reminded him where he had started. More importantly, it reminded him never to become proud. He climbed onto the bicycle. I'll see everyone at the meeting. Musa shook his head with an amused smile. Safe ride, sir. The journey to the wedding venue took nearly 40 minutes. Michael cycled at an unhurried pace. The city had changed dramatically since the days when he delivered parcels from market to market. New flyovers crossed busy intersections. Modern office buildings stretched toward the sky. Luxury apartments overlooked roads that had once been filled with potholes. At a traffic light, two young boys recognized the expensive wristwatch beneath Michael's jacket sleeve. One whispered to the other, "That watch looks real." The second laughed. "If he owns a watch like that, why is he riding such an old bicycle?" Michael overheard them. He simply smiled and continued pedaling when the light turned green. Not everyone needed an explanation. Meanwhile, excitement inside the wedding venue continued to grow. Richard Benson stood inside the groom's lounge surrounded by friends. His white tuxedo fit perfectly. Diamond cufflinks sparkled beneath the lights. An expensive gold watch rested confidently on his wrist. He examined himself in a mirror before turning toward his best man. Everything ready? Perfect. The media? Already outside. The investors? They've confirmed they'll attend the reception. Richard smiled confidently. Excellent. Today's wedding wasn't only about love. It was also an opportunity to impress powerful business leaders. His company had spent nearly 8 months negotiating with an international logistics corporation called Horizon Global Logistics. The investment under discussion was enormous. If finalized, it would transform Richard's business empire forever. His financial advisor entered the room carrying a tablet. "Sir." "Yes. We've received confirmation." Richard looked up. "The chairman of Horizon Global Logistics will attend personally." His eyes widened. Finally. For years, nobody had managed to meet the mysterious founder. The man rarely appeared in public. He never gave interviews. Almost no photographs existed. Even many business publications used older corporate images because recent ones were unavailable. Richard adjusted his tie. This is becoming an even better day. In the bridal suite, Sandra admired herself one final time. The wedding gown looked even more breathtaking than she remembered. Her bridesmaids surrounded her, taking photographs and complimenting every detail. "You look like royalty." Richard won't stop staring. "This wedding will trend everywhere." Sandra smiled proudly. Then one bridesmaid glanced through the window. "I think your special guest just arrived." Sandra walked toward the glass. Outside, she saw him, Michael, riding an old bicycle through the main entrance. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. She blinked twice. Surely she wasn't seeing correctly. But there he was, wearing simple clothes, calmly pedaling toward one of the most luxurious wedding venues in Lagos. One bridesmaid burst into laughter. "He actually came." Another covered her mouth. Oh my goodness! He really came on a bicycle. Soon the entire room filled with laughter. Sandra slowly smiled. I honestly didn't think he'd do that. One bridesmaid shook her head. This is embarrassing. Sandra looked at Michael through the window. No, it's exactly what I expected. Outside, several valets paused as Michael parked the bicycle neatly beside a fence. Rows upon rows of luxury vehicles surrounded it. The contrast couldn't have been greater. One young valet whispered, "Does he know where he is?" Another laughed. "Maybe he delivers food." Michael locked the bicycle carefully. Before walking away, he gently patted the handlebars. "Wait for me." Nearby security guards exchanged amused looks. One approached politely. "Good morning." "Morning. Are you sure you're attending the wedding?" Michael showed his invitation. The guard studied it carefully before apologizing. "I'm sorry, sir." "No problem." Michael smiled kindly. The guard handed back the invitation. "Please enjoy the ceremony." As Michael walked toward the entrance, he heard several guests quietly laughing behind him. He ignored them completely. Inside the reception hall, conversations gradually faded as people noticed the unusually dressed guest entering. Some recognized him immediately. Others simply assumed he was someone who had mistaken the venue. Sandra spotted him before anyone else. She gracefully walked across the hall, attracting curious glances. When she stopped in front of Michael, an awkward silence settled over the nearby guests. "So," she folded her arms. "You actually came." Michael smiled politely. "You invited me. I didn't think you'd accept. I considered declining." "What changed?" He looked around the beautifully decorated hall. "I decided everyone deserves happiness." Sandra studied his face carefully. Something felt different. She had expected sadness, embarrassment, jealousy. Instead, Michael appeared completely at peace. The realization irritated her more than she cared to admit. Her eyes moved toward the bicycle visible through the entrance. "You still ride that thing?" Michael glanced outside. "Yes, it still works." Several nearby guests laughed. Sandra forced a sympathetic smile. "Things must still be difficult." Michael answered simply, "Life has been interesting." She interpreted his answer exactly as she wanted. "I suppose not everyone gets a happy ending." Michael merely smiled. "Maybe not." One of Sandra's friends approached. "Who's this?" Sandra looked directly at Michael. "My ex-husband." The woman raised her eyebrows dramatically. "Oh," another friend joined them. "This is Michael? The transport businessman?" Sandra nodded. "Former transport businessman." The emphasis on the word former wasn't accidental. Michael noticed. He said nothing. Within minutes, whispers spread rapidly throughout the venue. "That's Sandra's ex-husband. The one who lost everything. He came on a bicycle. Poor man." Several guests openly stared. Others secretly took photographs with their phones. One young influencer quietly recorded a short video. She whispered into her camera, "This is unbelievable." None of them recognized the face they were recording. An usher approached respectfully. "Sir, may I show you your seat?" Michael nodded. Sandra spoke before he could follow. "Actually," she smiled sweetly, "please seat him somewhere comfortable." The usher nodded. "Certainly." Sandra pointed discreetly toward the last row. "The very back." The usher understood immediately. Michael understood too. Still, he simply followed without complaint. As they walked through the hall, dozens of curious eyes followed him. The farther he walked, the fewer guests remained seated nearby. Finally, he reached the final row, almost hidden behind a decorative flower arrangement. The usher looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, sir." Michael smiled warmly. "It's fine." He sat down quietly. From there, he could see the entire stage. It reminded him strangely of his early business meetings where he had often observed quietly before speaking. Nearby, two elderly women whispered loudly enough for him to hear. "It's unfortunate. He must still love her. Otherwise, why would he come?" Another man chuckled. Maybe he hoped she'd change her mind. Someone else added, at least they gave him food. Laughter followed. Michael remained completely calm. He wasn't there to prove anything. He simply watched people. The waiters working tirelessly, the cleaners adjusting chairs, the security guards greeting guests, the musicians preparing their instruments. Years of building Horizon Global Logistics had taught him something valuable. Every successful event depended on people others rarely noticed. He smiled at one young waiter carrying an impossibly heavy tray. The nervous young man smiled back gratefully. At the front of the hall, Richard finally noticed Michael. He leaned toward Sandra. Is that him? She nodded. My ex. Richard looked briefly toward the back, then shrugged. He looks harmless. He is. Richard laughed quietly. I almost feel sorry for him. Sandra smiled. Don't. He made his choices. Richard nodded confidently before returning his attention to greeting wealthy guests. To him, Michael was irrelevant. Simply another forgotten chapter in Sandra's life. He had no idea that the quiet man seated in the final row represented something far greater than anyone inside the hall could imagine. Outside the venue, however, far beyond the laughter, far beyond the whispers, far beyond the mockery, a distant convoy of black luxury vehicles had just turned onto the road leading toward the wedding. Inside those vehicles sat international board members, regional directors, legal advisors, and senior executives from Horizon Global Logistics. Every one of them had arrived for an important meeting with the company's founder. None of them knew he was already inside the venue, sitting quietly in the very last row, waiting. The wedding ceremony had just begun. Soft music drifted through the grand hall as the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone to what he described as the wedding of the year. Hundreds of elegantly dressed guests settled into their seats. Television cameras slowly moved through the aisles. Photographers positioned themselves near the flower-covered stage, waiting for the perfect moments to capture. At the front, Richard Benson stood confidently beside his best man. His tailored white tuxedo fit perfectly. His polished shoes reflected the lights hanging from the crystal chandeliers. Every few seconds, he glanced toward the entrance, waiting for Sandra to appear. He looked every bit like the successful millionaire businessman the magazines celebrated. Behind him, a massive LED screen displayed photographs from their engagement shoot. Private beaches, luxury hotels, helicopter rides, sunset yacht cruises. Every image projected wealth. Every image projected perfection. The guests admired the slideshow. They really are the perfect couple. This wedding must have cost a fortune. I've never seen decorations like this. Richard smiled proudly. He enjoyed hearing those comments. For him, admiration was almost as valuable as success itself. At the very back of the hall, Michael sat quietly in his chair. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't watching the decorations. He was watching the people. Years of building Horizon Global Logistics had taught him something few executives understood. A business wasn't truly measured by how its owners behaved. It was measured by how everyone else was treated. He noticed a young cleaner quietly picking up flower petals that guests had dropped on the floor. She worked carefully, trying not to interrupt anyone. A waiter accidentally bumped into one of the guests while serving drinks. The guest immediately shouted at him, "Watch where you're going." The frightened waiter apologized repeatedly. Michael noticed another waiter quietly step beside his colleague, gently helping him steady the tray before anyone else noticed. Simple acts, small moments. They revealed far more about people's character than expensive speeches ever could. Sandra entered the hall to thunderous applause. The orchestra changed melodies. Everyone stood. Her sparkling white gown shimmered beneath the lights. The long train flowed gracefully behind her as four little flower girls carefully followed. Guests smiled. Several women wiped tears from their eyes. Photographers captured every step. Richard stared at his bride with admiration. "You look incredible," he whispered as she reached him. Sandra smiled brightly. "Thank you." For a few moments, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The officiating minister welcomed everyone. Family members smiled proudly. Friends applauded. The ceremony moved forward beautifully. Then, a wedding planner hurried toward Richard. She whispered something into his ear. Richard's expression immediately changed. "What?" she repeated herself. His eyes widened. "Are you sure?" She nodded. Richard looked toward one of his financial advisors seated in the front row. The advisor stood and hurried over. "What happened?" "The convoy." "What convoy?" "They've arrived." The advisor looked confused. "So?" Richard lowered his voice. "Horizon Global." The advisor's face instantly brightened. "The chairman?" Richard nodded. "He's here." Outside the venue, security personnel suddenly became unusually active. Police motorcycles appeared first. Their flashing lights reflected across the polished entrance gates. Then came the first black armored SUV. Another followed. Then another. Then several long luxury sedans. More SUVs. More executive vehicles. The convoy seemed endless. Guests standing outside stopped talking. Valets froze. Several journalists immediately turned their cameras toward the entrance. One whispered excitedly, "Someone important just arrived." Luxury vehicles were common at Richard's events. But this was something entirely different. Every vehicle carried the discreet silver emblem of Horizon Global Logistics. Business reporters instantly recognized it. One journalist quickly called her cameraman. "Don't miss this. If the chairman steps out today, it'll be the first clear public footage in years." The cameraman quickly adjusted his lens. Inside the hall, Richard could barely hide his excitement. He leaned toward Sandra. "My biggest investor just arrived." She smiled. "Now?" He nodded enthusiastically. "This couldn't have happened at a better time." "What does he look like?" Richard laughed softly. "No one really knows. I've only spoken with his executives. But today," he straightened his jacket proudly, "I finally get to meet the man." Sandra squeezed his hand. "I'm sure he'll be impressed." Richard smiled confidently. "So am I." Neither of them noticed Michael quietly checking his wristwatch. His board members were right on schedule. Outside, the convoy came to a smooth stop. Drivers stepped out first. Then security personnel. Next came several elegantly dressed executives carrying leather briefcases. One by one they exited the vehicles. Men, women, different nationalities, different ages. Yet all wore identical Horizon Global Logistics executive identification badges. Several guests whispered among themselves, "There must be 20 of them." "No." I counted nearly 30. Why would so many executives attend a wedding? One elderly businessman recognized several faces immediately. He quietly gasped, "That's Daniel Okoro, the vice chairman. And that's Maria Alvarez, the European regional director." Another guest added, "I've seen that gentleman in Forbes." Someone else pointed discreetly, "Those are board members." The realization spread quickly. This wasn't merely a group of company representatives. The highest leadership of Horizon Global Logistics had arrived together. Richard hurried toward the entrance before the ceremony could continue. Several photographers followed. Sandra remained near the altar, smiling politely while guests wondered what was happening. Richard reached the front doors just as Daniel Okoro stepped inside. He immediately extended his hand. "Mr. Okoro." Daniel smiled courteously. "Good afternoon. Welcome. It's an honor." Richard glanced behind him. "We're deeply grateful your chairman could attend." Daniel looked slightly surprised. "He arrived already." Richard blinked. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded. "He came ahead of us." Confusion spread across Richard's face. "He did. About 40 minutes ago." Richard frowned. "There must be some mistake." Daniel shook his head. "No mistake. Our chairman always prefers arriving quietly." Richard looked toward the entrance. "But I didn't receive him." Daniel smiled knowingly. "He probably preferred it that way." Richard quickly turned toward his event coordinator. "Find him. Immediately." She nodded nervously before rushing away. Meanwhile, Michael remained seated in the last row. He watched the entire scene unfold with quiet amusement. Several board members entered the hall. The moment they spotted him, they immediately changed direction. Instead of walking toward the front rows reserved for VIP guests, they began moving steadily toward the back. Guests noticed. Conversations slowly faded. One businessman whispered, "Where are they going?" Another replied, "Perhaps another executive is seated back there." A woman turned around curiously. "So many important people. Who are they greeting?" The procession continued. Vice Chairman Daniel, Chief Financial Officer Maria Alvarez, Operations Director Hassan Ibrahim, Technology Chief Ethan Brooks, regional presidents from Europe, Asia, North America, and Africa. Nearly every senior executive walked calmly toward the last row. Richard watched in complete confusion. "They're going the wrong way." His financial advisor frowned. "No. They know exactly where they're going." Michael finally stood. The first executive reached him. Without hesitation, Daniel smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Chairman." He respectfully extended both hands. Michael shook them. "Good afternoon, Daniel. You arrived safely?" "Yes." Another executive stepped forward. "Good afternoon, sir." "Welcome." Then another. And another. Within seconds, every executive had formed a respectful line. Each greeted Michael individually. Some bowed their heads slightly. Others warmly shook his hand. Several addressed him simply as Chairman. The entire hall fell silent. Even the musicians stopped playing. Photographers instinctively turned their cameras toward the unexpected gathering. Richard stared without blinking. His lips slowly parted. "What?" He looked toward Daniel, then toward Michael, then back again. His voice barely emerged. "Chairman." Sandra turned around. The smile disappeared from her face. She looked toward the back. Michael stood surrounded by some of the most influential business leaders in the world. They weren't mocking him. They weren't greeting him casually. They were treating him with unmistakable respect. One elderly guest adjusted his glasses. "I know that face." Another businessman quickly searched his phone. Horizon Global Logistics. Several articles appeared. Old interviews, corporate announcements, award ceremonies. A younger version of Michael stood beside shipping containers during Horizon's earliest international expansion. The businessman's hands began trembling. "Oh my God! What? This?" He held up the phone. "This is him." Nearby guests crowded around. Another searched independently. The same face appeared, only slightly older now. Shock spread rapidly through the room. "It can't be. The bicycle? The ex-husband?" "No." Someone whispered almost inaudibly. "He's Michael Adeyemi, the founder, the billionaire." Sandra felt her bouquet slipping from her fingers. Her breathing became shallow. She stared at Michael as though seeing him for the very first time. Images flooded her mind. The tiny apartment, the empty wardrobe, the rainy night she walked away, the words she had spoken. "Love doesn't pay bills." Then another memory, the invitation. "Come and witness the life you could never give me." Her knees suddenly felt weak. The realization crashed into her all at once. The man she had mocked, the man she had seated at the back, the man who had arrived on an old bicycle, was wealthier than every guest in the hall combined. Richard hurried forward. His voice shook. "Mr." He stopped. Daniel gently corrected him. "Chairman Adeyemi." Richard swallowed hard. His confidence had vanished. "You." Michael smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Richard. You know my name?" Michael nodded. "I've heard a great deal about your company." Richard tried forcing a smile. We've been negotiating with Horizon." "I know. Our investment." "I know." Richard suddenly remembered every moment from the past hour. The laughter, the whispers, the last row seat, the mocking glances. A cold feeling settled deep inside his stomach. Television cameras continued recording. Journalists quickly recognized the magnitude of what they were witnessing. One reporter whispered excitedly into her microphone, "This is unbelievable. The mysterious founder of Horizon Global Logistics has just been identified publicly." Another cameraman zoomed in on Michael's old bicycle, still visible outside through the entrance. The contrast was astonishing. A billionaire, arriving alone, on a worn-out bicycle. Daniel looked toward Michael respectfully. "Chairman, the board meeting is scheduled to begin in 1 hour." Michael nodded. "Thank you. We'll leave after the ceremony." Of course. The executives remained standing respectfully nearby. None attempted to sit before he did. Guests noticed every detail. Respect like that couldn't be purchased. It had to be earned. The wedding ceremony had completely stopped. Nobody cared about the decorations anymore. Nobody discussed the expensive flowers. Nobody admired Richard's luxury watch. Every conversation centered around one man, Michael, the quiet guest everyone had laughed at, the humble man who never defended himself, the billionaire who had allowed people to reveal their true character before revealing his identity. As silence filled the magnificent hall, Michael looked around calmly. His eyes briefly met Sandra's. She looked frozen, ashamed, unable to speak. Michael simply offered a small, polite nod. Not a nod of victory, not a nod of revenge. Just the quiet acknowledgement of two people whose lives had once traveled the same road before destiny led them in completely different directions. No one in that hall would ever forget what had happened. And deep inside, every person who had laughed at the man on the bicycle was asking themselves the same painful question. How many extraordinary people had they overlooked simply because they judged them by appearances? Silence settled over the wedding hall like a heavy blanket. Just moments earlier, the room had been filled with laughter, cheerful conversations, and the soft melodies of the orchestra. Now no one spoke. The only sound came from the clicking of cameras as photographers desperately tried to capture every second of what was unfolding. Dozens of eyes remained fixed on Michael, the man who had entered quietly on an old bicycle, the man who had been mocked, the man who had been pushed to the last row, the man who had just been addressed as chairman by some of the most powerful business executives in the world. Sandra felt as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. Her bouquet slipped from her trembling hands and landed softly on the polished floor. She barely noticed. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She stared at Michael, searching his face for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, some elaborate joke, some unbelievable coincidence. But there was none. His calm expression never changed. Richard finally found his voice. There must be some mistake." Nobody answered. He looked toward Daniel Okoro, Horizon Global Logistics Vice Chairman. "You said chairman." Daniel nodded politely. "Yes." Richard forced an awkward laugh. "No, I mean..." He pointed toward Michael. "Him." "Yes." Daniel looked genuinely confused by the question. "Our founder. Our chairman. Mr. Michael Adeyemi." The words echoed through the hall. Several guests gasped audibly. Richard's financial advisor slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He had spent nearly 8 months negotiating investment discussions with Horizon Global Logistics. The company had insisted that final approval rested with one man, Chairman Michael Adeyemi. No one outside the company's highest leadership had ever met him. There were very few recent photographs. Michael preferred staying out of the media. Many investors assumed he lived somewhere in Europe or America. Others believed he traveled constantly by private jet. None had imagined he would quietly ride an old bicycle into a wedding. One elderly businessman hurriedly opened a financial news website on his phone. His hands shook as he searched. Horizon Global Logistics founder. Within seconds, articles filled the screen. Africa's quiet logistics genius expands into South America. Horizon Global acquires European shipping network. The billionaire who refuses celebrity status. Most articles used older corporate photographs. Some showed Michael standing inside warehouses. Others showed him inspecting shipping ports. One magazine estimated his personal wealth at several $1 billion. The businessman turned his phone toward the guests nearest him. "It's him." Another guest quickly searched. Then another. Soon dozens of phones displayed the same face. Whispers spread rapidly across the room. "Oh my goodness! He really is the founder. I've read about this company. They operate in over 80 countries. My company tried partnering with them last year. Their valuation is unbelievable." What did they say his net worth was? Several $1 billion. The words moved through the crowd like wildfire. Sandra couldn't breathe properly. She remembered every conversation she had ever had with Michael. Every promise. Every struggle. Every sacrifice. She remembered him coming home exhausted after driving deliveries all day. She remembered him skipping meals so employees could receive their salaries. She remembered the nights he sat at the dining table surrounded by financial papers, desperately trying to save his company. Then, she remembered leaving. She remembered standing in that apartment with her suitcase. She remembered saying the words she had believed completely. "Love doesn't pay bills." At the time, she had thought she was choosing security. Now, those same words echoed in her mind like a cruel punishment. The officiating minister quietly stepped away from the altar. Even he understood the ceremony could not continue until everyone understood what was happening. Journalists moved closer. Television cameras focused entirely on Michael. One reporter whispered excitedly, "This is the biggest business story of the year." Another cameraman replied, "No one has clear footage of him. We're getting history." Daniel noticed the growing confusion. He smiled politely before addressing Richard. "I believe introductions are overdue." Richard nodded numbly. Daniel turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Daniel Okoro. I serve as Vice Chairman of Horizon Global Logistics." He gestured respectfully toward Michael. "This is our founder, our chairman, the man who started Horizon from nothing." Several executives smiled proudly. Daniel continued, "Many people know our company. Very few know the man behind it. Chairman Adeyemi prefers building businesses rather than building publicity." He paused briefly. That has always been his way. Maria Alvarez, Horizon's chief financial officer, stepped forward. "I've worked with Chairman Adeyemi for 11 years. She smiled warmly at Michael before turning toward the guests. "When I first met him, I assumed he was another ordinary consultant." She laughed softly. "Then he redesigned an entire international supply chain in one afternoon." Several executives nodded. Another board member joined the conversation. "I remember our first warehouse inspection together. He wore overalls. Workers thought he was a maintenance supervisor." Someone else smiled. They only realized who he was after he solved problems that experts had ignored for months. The executives laughed gently. Not mockingly, fondly. These stories weren't unusual to them. They had witnessed Michael's humility for years. Richard listened in stunned silence. Everything suddenly made sense. The calm confidence, the simple smile, the complete lack of insecurity. Michael hadn't behaved like a poor man pretending to be comfortable. He had behaved like someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Richard felt a growing knot in his stomach. He glanced toward Sandra. She looked completely devastated. One of the younger guests cautiously raised his hand. "Excuse me." Everyone turned toward him. He looked at Daniel. "If Chairman Adeyemi is worth billions." He hesitated awkwardly. "Why did he come on a bicycle?" The question hung in the air. Daniel smiled. "I wondered the same thing years ago." The executives laughed knowingly. Daniel continued, "Our chairman still owns the bicycle he used after losing everything." Several guests exchanged confused looks. Daniel nodded. "Yes. He built Horizon while riding that bicycle. It reminds him where he came from. He says success should improve your character, not erase your past." Silence followed. Many guests instinctively looked toward the bicycle parked outside the entrance. Only minutes earlier they had laughed at it. Now, it looked almost symbolic. An elderly woman sitting near the front wiped tears from her eyes. I judged him. She whispered the words to herself. I looked at that bicycle and decided who he was. Her husband squeezed her hand gently. We all did. Nearby, the young waiter who had earlier been shouted at quietly smiled. He remembered the only guest who had smiled kindly at him. Michael. The cleaner who had been picking flower petals from the floor also remembered. He had thanked her when nobody else noticed her work. Without realizing it, Michael had treated everyone exactly the same. Rich, poor, executive, waiter, cleaner, security guard. It had never mattered to him. Sandra slowly walked toward Michael. Each step felt heavier than the last. The entire hall watched. She stopped several feet away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sandra whispered, Michael. He looked at her calmly. Congratulations. His voice carried no anger, no bitterness, only quiet sincerity. She felt tears forming immediately. You. She struggled to continue. You really built all this? Michael nodded gently. It took time. She looked around at the executives surrounding him. They all work with you? They work with me. She lowered her eyes. Her voice broke. I didn't know. Michael remained silent. What could he possibly say? She was right. She hadn't known. But she also hadn't stayed long enough to find out. Richard slowly approached as well. Unlike Sandra, his face reflected complete disbelief. I have to ask. Michael looked toward him. When exactly? Richard hesitated. When did all this happen? Michael smiled slightly. After my transport company failed. Richard frowned. But you lost everything. I did. And then I started again. With what? Michael glanced briefly toward the bicycle outside. That. Richard followed his gaze. The bicycle? Michael nodded. I delivered packages. I studied. I learned. I failed again. I learned more. The hall remained completely silent. Michael wasn't telling the story dramatically. He simply stated facts. I eventually earned a consulting opportunity. One opportunity became another. Then came an international contract. That contract became Horizon. Several guests listened with amazement. To Michael, the journey sounded simple. To everyone else, it sounded almost impossible. One journalist carefully raised a microphone. Chairman Adeyemi. Michael looked toward her. May I ask something? He nodded. Millions of entrepreneurs fail every year. What made you continue after losing everything? Michael became thoughtful. He looked around the hall before answering. When my business collapsed, I believed losing money was the worst thing that could happen. He paused. Then I discovered something. The room remained completely still. I hadn't lost my knowledge. I hadn't lost my work ethic. I hadn't lost my integrity. I still had those. He smiled gently. And as long as I still had those, I wasn't truly poor. The words settled deeply over the audience. Several people quietly lowered their heads. Richard's financial advisor suddenly remembered something. He quickly opened the investment documents on his tablet. His face drained of color. He leaned toward Richard and whispered, Sir. What? The final investment approval. Yes. It requires Chairman Adeyemi's personal signature. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The realization hit him with crushing force. The very man whose approval he desperately needed was the man he had unknowingly insulted. Sandra looked at Michael once more. She noticed something she had never truly appreciated before. Peace. Years earlier, Michael had constantly worried about bills, employees, debt, the future. Today, despite becoming one of the richest men in the world, he looked calmer than ever. It wasn't the calmness of wealth. It was the calmness of a man who had survived losing everything and discovered that his value had never depended on money in the first place. One by one, guests who had laughed earlier quietly looked away. The businessmen who had mocked his clothes. The women who had whispered behind his back. The influencers who had secretly recorded videos. the friends who had treated him as entertainment. Every one of them suddenly felt embarrassed. No one apologized yet. No one moved. They simply stood there, confronted by the uncomfortable truth. Their opinions had been based entirely on appearances. Michael had never needed to expose them. They had exposed themselves. And in that magnificent wedding hall, surrounded by crystal chandeliers, imported flowers, and unimaginable luxury, the richest lesson of the day had nothing to do with money. It was the simple realization that true greatness often arrives quietly, dressed in ordinary clothes, asking for nothing more than a seat, while the world is too busy judging appearances to recognize it. The grand wedding hall remained unusually quiet. Just minutes earlier, every conversation had revolved around designer gowns, expensive decorations, celebrity guests, and Richard Benson's extravagant lifestyle. Now no one cared about any of those things. The flowers were still beautiful. The chandeliers still sparkled. The orchestra still waited patiently. Yet the entire atmosphere had changed. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on Michael, not because he had demanded attention, but because the truth had completely rewritten the story everyone thought they understood. The poor ex-husband they had laughed at was, in reality, the billionaire founder of one of the world's fastest-growing logistics companies. The irony was almost unbelievable, and no one felt its weight more than Sandra. She stood frozen in the middle of the aisle. Her wedding gown, which had felt like a crown only moments ago, suddenly seemed unbearably heavy. The applause she had imagined receiving no longer mattered. The expensive diamonds around her neck no longer felt special. All she could see was Michael. For years she had imagined this moment differently. She had imagined him arriving with his shoulders bent in defeat, quietly watching her marry a richer man. She had imagined herself finally proving that leaving him had been the right decision. Instead, she had become the one standing in shame. Tears gathered in her eyes before she could stop them. She slowly walked toward him. Every step felt longer than the last. The guests instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path between them. Michael watched her approach without changing his expression. When she finally stopped in front of him, she lowered her head. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence was louder than any argument. Finally, Sandra whispered, "I'm sorry." Her voice was barely audible. Michael looked at her quietly. For what? The simple question broke something inside her. She laughed weakly through her tears. For everything. Sandra wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. I've replayed that night in my head so many times. Michael remained silent. I convinced myself that leaving was the only choice. She swallowed hard. I kept telling myself that I deserved a better life. She looked around the magnificent hall. I thought this was that better life. Her voice cracked. But now. She couldn't finish the sentence. Michael completed it gently. Now you're questioning your decision. She nodded slowly. Yes. He studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke calmly. Everyone makes choices. Sandra looked at him hopefully. I made mine. So did you. She closed her eyes. I chose money. Michael didn't deny it. You chose certainty. I thought wealth meant security. It often does. But it doesn't guarantee peace. Sandra stared at him. There was no bitterness in his voice. No sarcasm. No desire to humiliate her. That somehow hurt even more. The memories came flooding back. She remembered their tiny apartment. The cracked walls. The unreliable electricity. The nights they laughed under candlelight when the power failed. She remembered Michael waking before sunrise every day without complaint. She remembered him refusing to delay employees' salaries even when it meant skipping meals himself. She remembered how proudly he had spoken about honesty. Back then, she had admired those qualities. Later, she had begun to resent them. You cared too much about everyone else, she whispered. Michael smiled faintly. I cared about doing what was right. I wanted you to think about us. I was. No, she shook her head. You were thinking about principles. I was thinking about survival. Michael looked at her kindly. Maybe we were both right. The unexpected answer left her speechless. Nearby, Sandra's bridesmaids watched anxiously. One of them whispered, "Should we stop her?" Another quietly shook her head. "No. This is something she has to do." Even the guests who had mocked Michael earlier remained silent. No one interrupted. No one laughed. The entire hall seemed to understand that something much deeper than wealth was unfolding. Sandra looked directly into Michael's eyes. "I have to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When did you stop hating me?" Michael blinked. "I never hated you." She frowned. "After everything I did?" He nodded. "Hatred is exhausting. I had more important things to focus on." She looked genuinely confused. "You weren't angry?" "I was. For a while." "What changed?" Michael looked toward the bicycle visible outside through the entrance. "Work." She followed his gaze. "The bicycle reminded me every day that I had two choices." "What choices?" "I could spend my life blaming you, or spend my life rebuilding myself." Sandra slowly lowered her head. "And you chose to rebuild." "I did." Her tears fell freely now. "I wish I had stayed." Michael said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The past could not be rewritten. Several meters away, Richard stood motionless. For the first time in years, he had absolutely no idea what to do. Business negotiations had always been easy for him. He understood numbers, contracts, investments, risk, but this was different. He glanced toward his financial advisor. The older man looked deeply worried. "What now?" Richard whispered. The advisor answered honestly. "I don't know." Richard rubbed his forehead. "You said this investment would secure our expansion." "It would." "And now?" The advisor hesitated. "Everything depends on Chairman Adeyemi." Richard looked toward Michael again. The realization was almost unbearable. His company's future rested in the hands of the very man he had unknowingly insulted. Richard took a deep breath. Then he slowly walked toward Michael. Every executive from Horizon Global Logistics watched carefully. Daniel stepped slightly forward, but Michael subtly shook his head. It was fine. Richard stopped a respectful distance away. "Chairman Adeyemi." Michael nodded politely. "Richard." Richard looked uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology." Michael remained silent. "I welcomed every wealthy guest personally." Richard's voice grew quieter. "But I barely noticed you." Michael smiled gently. "You didn't know who I was." "That's exactly the problem." Richard sighed heavily. "I only valued the people I believed could benefit me." Michael looked at him thoughtfully. Richard continued, "I judged you before I even spoke to you." Again, Michael didn't argue, because it was true. Richard lowered his head. "I've spent years building businesses. I've negotiated with governments. I've signed international contracts. But today," he gave a bitter smile, "I discovered how little I actually understand about people." Michael folded his hands calmly. "What makes you say that?" Richard laughed quietly. "I spent millions organizing this wedding. I wanted everyone to see success." He looked around the magnificent hall. But the person with the greatest success walked in on a bicycle. Several guests smiled awkwardly. Richard continued, "And I couldn't recognize him." Michael finally spoke. "Success rarely announces itself." Richard nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Michael smiled. "Do you?" Richard looked surprised. Michael continued, "If I had arrived in one of my cars, you would have welcomed me at the entrance. Probably. You would have seated me in the front. Yes. You would have introduced me to everyone. Of course." Michael's expression remained calm. But none of that would have revealed anyone's true character. Silence followed. Richard understood immediately. Michael hadn't allowed the humiliation to happen because he enjoyed it. He had simply refused to interrupt people while they revealed themselves. Across the hall, several guests quietly looked away in embarrassment. One businessman whispered to his wife, "I laughed." She nodded sadly. "So did I." Another guest quietly deleted the mocking video he had recorded earlier. An influencer who had uploaded a photograph of Michael arriving on the bicycle hurriedly removed it from her social media page. Too late. Thousands had already seen it. Now the comments had completely changed. People online had already begun identifying Michael. The story was spreading rapidly across the internet. Headlines appeared within minutes. Billionaire founder arrives at wedding on bicycle. Guests mock mystery billionaire before learning his identity. Humble business leader teaches wedding guests a lesson they will never forget. Journalists rushed outside to broadcast live updates. The wedding had become national news. Sandra looked toward Michael again. There was something else. He waited patiently. I said something terrible to you. You said many things. She managed a weak smile through her tears. I know. She inhaled deeply. I said. Her voice almost disappeared. Love doesn't pay bills. The words hung in the air. Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Michael remembered that night perfectly. The rain. The empty apartment. The closing door. For years those words had echoed in his heart. Sandra looked at him desperately. I was wrong. Michael remained quiet. I thought money was everything. She looked around the luxurious venue. Now I realize. She struggled to continue. I confused wealth with happiness. Michael answered gently. Many people do. I lost someone who genuinely loved me. Michael didn't respond immediately. Finally he said, we both lost something. She looked surprised. What did you lose? He smiled sadly. The woman I thought would stay beside me no matter what. Those words pierced Sandra's heart, because they were true. She hadn't simply left a struggling husband. She had abandoned the promise they had made to each other. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The orchestra remained silent. The officiating minister waited patiently. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Some moments deserved privacy, even in a room full of people. Finally, Sandra whispered the question that had been growing inside her since learning the truth. Can you ever forgive me? Michael looked at her for a long time. His answer came softly. I forgave you years ago. Sandra blinked. You did. I had to. Why? Because carrying bitterness would have kept me trapped in the past. She felt hope rising inside her. Then, she hesitated. Is there any chance? She couldn't finish the sentence. Michael understood anyway. He smiled kindly. No. Her face fell. I don't say that because I hate you. I know. I say it because forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. She slowly nodded. I understand. He continued gently. I forgave you, but the life we shared ended the day you walked out. Tears rolled freely down Sandra's face. She realized she wasn't mourning Michael's wealth. She was mourning the man she had failed to appreciate when he had nothing. And that loss could never be recovered. At that moment, Daniel quietly approached Michael. Chairman. Michael turned. Our board meeting begins in 45 minutes. Michael nodded. I'll be there. Daniel looked toward Richard. We're prepared whenever the chairman is. Richard's heart tightened. The reminder came at the worst possible time. The investment. His company's future. Everything still depended on what happened next. He looked at Michael with quiet desperation. Not as Sandra's former husband. Not as a billionaire. But as the one man capable of changing everything. The entire wedding hall seemed to hold its breath. Because everyone knew, the next conversation would determine far more than the fate of a wedding. It would reveal whether the quiet man on the bicycle would respond with revenge, or with the same grace that had carried him from complete ruin to unimaginable success. The silence inside the wedding hall lingered long after Sandra stepped back. Her tears had not stopped. Her carefully applied makeup had begun to run down her cheeks. But for the first time that day, she didn't care. Neither did anyone else. The extravagant decorations that had once been the center of attention now seemed insignificant. The flowers, the chandeliers, the luxury vehicles outside, the expensive wedding cake. None of them mattered anymore. Every guest was waiting for one thing, Michael's next decision. Especially Richard. Richard stood a few feet away, his hands clasped tightly together. Only an hour earlier, he had walked confidently through the venue. greeting wealthy guests with broad smiles and firm handshakes. Now, for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. Money could solve many problems, could buy beautiful buildings, luxury cars, private jets, the finest lawyers, the best consultants, but it could not erase the way he had treated Michael, nor could it force Michael to trust him. Richard took a slow breath before speaking. "Chairman Adeyemi." Michael looked at him calmly. "I owe you another apology. You've already apologized. I know, but I don't think you understand how ashamed I am." Michael remained silent. Richard continued. "When I first saw you," he looked toward the old bicycle visible outside, "I decided who you were before I even shook your hand." He gave a bitter smile. "I've spent years telling my managers never to judge clients. And yet, I couldn't follow my own advice." Michael nodded slightly. "It happens." Richard looked surprised. "You don't seem angry." Michael smiled gently. "What would anger accomplish?" Richard lowered his eyes. "I know this may not be the right time." He hesitated. "But my company has spent months negotiating with Horizon Global Logistics." Michael nodded. "I'm aware. Our expansion depends on your investment." "I know." Richard swallowed hard. "I also understand that after today." He struggled to continue. "You have every reason to walk away." The room became completely still. Even those standing at the back leaned forward slightly. Everyone knew about Richard's proposed partnership with Horizon. Several businessmen present understood just how valuable that investment would be. One whispered quietly, "If Horizon withdraws." Richard's financial advisor completed the sentence. "The expansion collapses." Daniel Okoro, Horizon's vice chairman, quietly stepped forward. "Chairman." Michael turned. Daniel spoke respectfully. "Our board has completed due diligence on Benson Holdings." Richard immediately looked toward him. Daniel continued, "The final approval requires only your signature." Richard's heart pounded. Months of negotiations, thousands of pages of reports, international legal reviews, financial audits, everything had reached this single moment. The decision rested entirely with Michael. Guests exchanged nervous glances. One elderly businessman whispered to another, "If I were him, I'd cancel everything." His friend nodded. "Anyone would." Nearby, one of Sandra's bridesmaids quietly agreed. After the humiliation today, there wouldn't even be a discussion. Many guests silently reached the same conclusion. They expected revenge. Perhaps not loud revenge, not angry revenge, but quiet business revenge. After all, who could blame Michael? He had been insulted, mocked, embarrassed, seated at the back of the hall like an unwanted guest. Now fate had placed enormous power in his hands. Most people believed they already knew what he would do. Michael looked toward Richard, then toward Sandra, then slowly around the hall. His eyes rested briefly on the waiters, the cleaners, the security guards, the photographers, the musicians. Finally, he spoke. "I have a question." Richard nodded immediately. "Anything." Michael pointed gently toward the young waiter who had been shouted at earlier. "What is his name?" Richard blinked. "I." He turned toward the event manager. The manager looked equally confused. "I don't know." Michael smiled softly. "I thought so." He then pointed toward the elderly cleaner quietly standing near the entrance. "And hers?" No one answered. Michael nodded. "I understand." He began walking slowly through the hall. The executives followed several steps behind, but he motioned for them to stay where they were. He wanted to walk alone. As he passed the waiter, he stopped. "What is your name?" The young man looked startled. "Samuel, sir." Michael smiled. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 3 years." "You've done a good job today." Samuel's eyes widened. "Thank you, sir." Michael continued walking. He stopped beside the cleaner. "And your name?" "Grace, sir." "How long have you worked here?" 6 years. Michael smiled warmly. "Thank you for keeping the venue beautiful." Grace's eyes filled with tears. No one had ever thanked her before. She managed a quiet smile. "You're welcome, sir." Michael turned back toward the guests. "Interesting." Nobody spoke. "I've been here less than an hour. I know Samuel. I know Grace. But the people who hired them." He looked toward Richard. "Don't." Richard lowered his head. The observation stung because it was true. Michael continued calmly. "A business isn't measured by the luxury cars outside. It's measured by how the people with the least power are treated." Silence spread across the room. Many executives present quietly nodded. They had heard Michael say similar words during company meetings countless times. Richard looked genuinely ashamed. "I've spent too much time chasing appearances." Michael smiled slightly. "We all chase something. I chased success. And forgot people." Michael nodded. "That's a dangerous trade." One journalist cautiously raised her microphone. "Chairman Adeyemi." Michael looked toward her. "May I ask a question?" He nodded. "If you reject the investment today, wouldn't everyone understand?" Several guests quietly agreed. Michael smiled. "They probably would." "Then why are you even considering it?" Michael paused thoughtfully before answering. "When I lost my first business, I blamed many people. My driver, the economy, the banks, my circumstances." He smiled gently. "Eventually I realized something." The room remained silent. "I couldn't control what happened, but I could control who I became afterward." He looked directly at Richard. "The same is true for everyone." Richard stepped forward. "I want to become better." Michael studied him carefully. "Do you?" Richard nodded firmly. "Yes." Michael asked another question. "If I were still poor, would this apology exist?" Richard froze. The question landed harder than any accusation. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he answered honestly, "No." The hall became completely silent. Richard continued, "I probably would have ignored you. I might not even have remembered your name." Michael nodded slowly. "Thank you." Richard looked confused. "For what?" "For telling the truth." Michael folded his hands behind his back. "Real change begins with honesty." He looked around the room. "Not with excuses." Then he turned toward Richard again. "I believe people can change." Hope flickered across Richard's face. "But," Michael continued, "trust isn't built in one conversation. It takes time." Richard nodded. "I understand." Daniel quietly stepped forward again, carrying a slim leather folder. Inside lay the investment agreement. Every executive watched carefully. Richard's financial advisor could barely breathe. Michael accepted the folder. He opened it slowly. The pages detailed months of negotiations. Infrastructure expansion, technology partnerships, warehousing projects, thousands of future jobs, communities that would benefit, families whose livelihoods depended on the project. He looked up, then closed the folder again. Without signing, Richard's heart sank. Michael spoke calmly. "I won't make this decision today." Richard looked surprised. "No?" Michael shook his head. "No." The hall filled with quiet whispers. Richard tried to remain composed. "May I ask why?" Michael nodded. "This morning, I learned something important about your company." Richard frowned. "What?" "I learned how quickly appearances influence decisions." Richard slowly lowered his head. Michael continued, "If we're going to become partners, I need confidence that today's lesson changes tomorrow's behavior." Richard looked genuinely disappointed. "So, the investment is canceled?" Michael shook his head again. "No." Hope returned. "It's postponed." Richard blinked. "Postponed." Michael nodded. "I want 6 months." The executives looked toward one another. Even Daniel seemed curious. Michael continued, "During those 6 months, I want Horizon's ethics team to quietly observe your company." Richard listened carefully. "No announcements. No publicity. No special treatment. I want them to see how your employees treat cleaners, drivers, security guards, receptionists, Customers. I want them to see how you treat people when you believe no one important is watching. The hall remained completely still. Richard understood immediately. Michael wasn't testing profits. He wasn't testing efficiency. He was testing character. Richard slowly nodded. I accept. Michael looked into his eyes. Do you really? Richard answered without hesitation. Yes. If my company fails that test, we don't deserve your partnership. Several Horizon executives smiled quietly. That answer mattered. Sandra watched the conversation with tears in her eyes. Years earlier, she had believed wealth meant having power over others. Now she watched a billionaire use his power very differently. Not to humiliate, not to destroy, but to encourage growth. She quietly whispered to herself, this is who he always was. The money hadn't changed Michael. It had simply given him a larger platform to remain the same man she had once fallen in love with. The realization hurt more than anything else. The officiating minister finally stepped forward. He looked uncertain. Should we? He glanced toward the couple. Continue the ceremony? Richard looked at Sandra. Sandra looked back. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally Richard answered quietly, yes. The minister nodded. The orchestra slowly resumed playing. Guests gradually returned to their seats. But something had changed. No one laughed as loudly anymore. No one boasted about expensive watches. No one compared luxury cars. The atmosphere had become unexpectedly reflective. As Michael prepared to leave with his executives, Samuel, the young waiter, gathered enough courage to approach him. Sir, Michael turned. I just wanted to thank you. For what? For remembering my name. Michael smiled warmly. Names matter. Samuel nodded emotionally. I'll never forget today. Michael placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Neither will I. Outside the venue, the afternoon sun reflected brightly across the line of black executive vehicles waiting patiently. The old bicycle still leaned quietly against the fence. Simple, unimpressive, ordinary, yet somehow, it had become the most unforgettable vehicle at the entire wedding. As Michael unlocked it, Daniel walked beside him. Chairman. Yes. You surprised us. Michael smiled. How? I thought you'd reject the partnership immediately. Michael looked toward the bicycle. I've learned something over the years. Daniel waited. Revenge teaches very little. But consequences, he smiled gently, can teach for a lifetime. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. He understood exactly what Michael meant. The greatest lesson of the day had never been about revealing a billionaire's identity. It had been about revealing everyone's character. And some lessons were too valuable to waste on simple revenge. The wedding ceremony eventually resumed. The orchestra played softly once more, but the music no longer carried the same excitement it had only an hour earlier. The guests applauded politely. The officiating minister continued with the vows. Richard and Sandra repeated the words expected of every bride and groom. Yet everyone in the hall knew something had changed. The wedding that was meant to celebrate luxury had unexpectedly become a lesson in humility. No amount of expensive decoration could erase what had happened. No speech could make people forget the quiet man who had arrived on an old bicycle. Michael quietly gathered his jacket. Daniel approached him. Chairman. Michael looked up. The board is ready. Michael nodded. Let's go. Several executives instinctively moved to escort him. Before they reached the exit, the elderly cleaner named Grace hurried toward him. She looked nervous. Sir. Michael stopped. Yes, Grace. She held out a neatly folded handkerchief. I think you dropped this. Michael looked at it and smiled. I did. He accepted it with both hands. Thank you. Grace hesitated before speaking again. I've worked at events like this for 6 years. Michael listened patiently. No guest has ever thanked me. Her eyes filled with tears. Until today. Michael smiled gently. My mother used to tell me something. Grace waited. The way you treat people who cannot help you tells the truth about your character. Grace nodded slowly. I'll remember that. So will I. They exchanged one final smile before Michael walked toward the entrance. Outside, dozens of journalists waited behind security barriers. News of the mysterious billionaire's identity had spread across the city within minutes. Television vans had arrived from multiple stations. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, each hoping to secure the first exclusive interview. The moment Michael stepped outside, microphones rose into the air. Chairman Adeyemi, sir, one question. Did you intentionally arrive on a bicycle? What message were you trying to send? How do you feel after today's events? Security personnel prepared to clear a path. Michael gently raised one hand. It's all right. The reporters immediately became quiet. A young journalist spoke first. Sir, why the bicycle? Michael glanced toward it. Its faded paint reflected the afternoon sunlight. Its worn handlebars looked almost insignificant beside the long row of luxury vehicles waiting nearby. He smiled. Because it reminds me where my second life began. The reporters listened carefully. When I lost everything, I bought that bicycle with almost the last money I had. I delivered packages. I learned. I failed. I learned again. He looked back toward the journalists. If success makes you forget your beginning, then success has already defeated you. Several reporters quickly wrote down every word. Another journalist raised her microphone. Sir, many people assumed you were poor. Michael smiled. I know. Were you offended? He thought for a moment. No. Why not? Because people can only judge what they see. He paused briefly. The important question isn't whether they judged me. It's why. The journalists exchanged thoughtful glances. A third reporter asked, what would you say to people who are currently struggling financially? Michael's expression softened. I would tell them something I wish someone had told me years ago. The cameras moved closer. Losing money isn't the same as losing your future. You can lose a business. You can lose a house. You can lose a job. But if you keep learning, if you keep your integrity, if you refuse to give up, you haven't truly lost. Silence followed. Even the reporters seemed moved. Daniel quietly checked his watch. Chairman. Michael nodded. I know. He walked toward the bicycle. Several executives instinctively reached for the doors of the waiting Rolls-Royce Phantom. One chauffeur stood respectfully beside it. The car is ready, sir. Michael smiled. Thank you. But not today. The chauffeur nodded without disappointment. He already knew the answer. Michael unlocked the bicycle. Before climbing onto it, he looked toward Daniel. I'll ride. Daniel laughed. We expected that. Several executives smiled. They had worked with Michael for years. To them, the bicycle wasn't unusual. It was simply part of who he was. Inside the wedding hall, guests watched through the enormous glass windows. Sandra stood silently beside Richard. She saw the chauffeur waiting beside the Rolls-Royce. She assumed Michael would finally reveal his wealth by stepping inside. Instead, he climbed back onto the old bicycle. Several guests looked confused. One businessman whispered, he still chooses the bicycle. Another quietly nodded. Now I understand. It was never about the bicycle. It was about the man. As Michael began pedaling away, something extraordinary happened. The convoy slowly started moving behind him. First came the police escort motorcycles, then the armored SUVs, then the executive sedans, then the luxury vehicles carrying Horizon's board members. Dozens of expensive cars. Following one old bicycle. People standing outside stopped walking. Drivers pulled over to watch. Pedestrians lifted their phones. Children pointed excitedly. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mummy, why are all those cars following the bicycle? His mother smiled softly. Because the man on the bicycle is leading them. The boy looked amazed. Really? Yes. He grinned. I want a bicycle too. His mother laughed. I think you missed the lesson. As the convoy disappeared down the road, the wedding venue grew strangely quiet. Inside the hall, conversations slowly resumed. But they sounded different now. An elderly businessman approached one of the waiters. "What was your name?" The waiter looked surprised. "Samuel, sir." The businessman smiled. "Thank you for your hard work today." Samuel blinked in surprise. "You're welcome, sir." Nearby, another guest walked over to Grace. "Thank you for keeping everything so clean." Grace smiled warmly. It was the second time someone had thanked her that day. Michael had already changed the atmosphere without even trying. Several weeks passed. News of the wedding spread far beyond Nigeria. Business magazines across Africa published the story. International newspapers described it as one of the most remarkable examples of humility in modern business. Social media filled with photographs of the bicycle. Many captions simply read, "Never judge anyone by appearances." The image became symbolic. Schools discussed it during leadership seminars. Business conferences referenced it during presentations on corporate culture. Entrepreneurs shared the story as motivation. Yet Michael never gave another interview about it. Whenever journalists contacted Horizon Global Logistics, his office politely declined. "The chairman prefers focusing on work." That was always the answer. Exactly 6 months later, Horizon Global Logistics completed its ethics review of Benson Holdings. For half a year, independent observers quietly visited Richard's companies, sometimes pretending to be customers, sometimes suppliers, sometimes job applicants, sometimes ordinary visitors. They observed everything: how receptionists welcomed strangers, how managers treated cleaners, how executives spoke to junior employees, whether promises were kept, whether workers felt respected. At the end of 6 months, Daniel carried the final report into Michael's office. Michael spent nearly 2 hours reading every page. When he finished, he smiled. "What do you think?" Daniel asked. Michael closed the folder. "I think someone learned." Daniel nodded. "The changes are genuine." They are. Richard had personally introduced new employee training programs, anonymous complaint systems, leadership workshops, fair promotion policies, recognition awards for cleaners, drivers, and security staff. Every employee, regardless of position, now attended the same annual appreciation dinner. Several managers who mistreated staff had been dismissed, not because Horizon demanded it, because Richard himself finally understood what leadership meant. A week later, Richard entered Horizon's headquarters. This time, he wasn't greeted because of his wealth. He was greeted because of his appointment. Daniel escorted him to Michael's office. Richard smiled nervously. "I've been waiting for this meeting." Michael stood and shook his hand warmly. "So have I." Richard sat down. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For not destroying me." Michael smiled. "That was never my goal." Richard nodded. "I know." He looked around the office. "I've spent 6 months trying to become the leader I should have been years ago." Michael opened the report again. "It shows." Richard smiled. "So." Michael reached for a fountain pen. Without saying another word, he signed the investment agreement. Richard stared at the signature for several seconds. His eyes became slightly moist. "I won't disappoint you." Michael extended his hand. "I know." The partnership officially began. Not because of revenge. Not because of pity. Because character had finally caught up with ambition. Sandra's life changed too. Her marriage survived, but not without difficulty. She often thought about Michael. Not because he was a billionaire, but because she finally understood what she had truly lost. She had abandoned a man of extraordinary character while searching for extraordinary wealth. Years later, she volunteered with organizations that helped struggling entrepreneurs and families facing financial hardship. Whenever someone complained that success should come quickly, she quietly shared a story, never mentioning names, only the lesson. Sometimes, she would say, "The person struggling today is building a future you cannot imagine." One quiet Sunday morning, Michael rode his bicycle through the same neighborhood where he had once delivered packages. The elderly mechanic who had sold it to him years earlier was still repairing bicycles beneath the same tree. The old man looked up and laughed. "You're still riding it?" Michael grinned. I told you I would. The mechanic shook his head in amazement. I see your face in newspapers now. Michael laughed. I try to avoid that. The old man wiped grease from his hands. You know, I've always wondered something. What? Why didn't you buy a new bicycle? Michael looked thoughtfully at the worn frame. Because every scratch on it tells a story. The mechanic smiled. I like that. So do I. As Michael rode away, children ran beside him for a short distance before waving goodbye. He smiled and waved back. The wind blew gently across his face. The bicycle chain made the same familiar sound it had made years earlier. Some things never needed changing. Far behind him, another convoy waited patiently. Luxury vehicles, security personnel, executives, the symbols of unimaginable success. Yet none of them defined Michael. His greatest achievement wasn't becoming a billionaire. It wasn't building a global logistics empire. It wasn't earning international respect. His greatest achievement was that success had never changed the values he carried when he owned nothing. Because true wealth is never measured by the size of your bank account. It is measured by the size of your character. And on the day everyone judged a man by an old bicycle, the richest person in the room turned out to be the one who had the least need to prove he was rich. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.